So one of the beautiful things about our faith is that there's a lot of different ways that we can express our spirituality. There's a lot of different ways we can get to know the Lord. And one of the ways that's been extremely helpful in my personal spiritual life is the way of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He's got a lot of practical, good advice, a lot of great, beautiful ways to pray. One of the principles of Ignatian spirituality, St. Ignatius, is called Agere Contra. And it's basically going against the grain. It's whenever you feel a resistance, whenever you've got two choices in front of you, you have to really look at the resistance and see what's going on here. I have some lack of freedom here, and so I can't make a good, total, and free choice until that boundary, that barrier is out of the way. So we hear in the second reading today from St. Paul, those having wives act as not having them, those weeping as not weeping, those rejoicing as not rejoicing. And I think that very well fits into this spiritual principle. The tendency is to just go for whatever has the least resistance in life. I'm sad, so I'm going to lean in on the sadness. I'm happy, so I lean in on the happiness. And that's good in a sense, but in another sense, it can very much just let us be pulled every direction, whatever the moment has in store for us. Maybe the gospel has a better example of all this. Think of these four men who were just called by Jesus. You've got Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And the way the gospel presents it, it's a pretty straightforward thing. They're working. Jesus says, hey, come follow me. And they say, great, I'll follow you. That sounds like a good idea. But can you imagine if you tease this whole story out? What if you actually had the insights into what Peter, James, John, and Andrew were all thinking? Now, I can't claim to be them, but maybe some of their thoughts were, oh, geez, I really like fishing. This has been my livelihood. I know with fishing I can have a certain way of life that I'm used to, that I'm comfortable with. Think to the end of John's gospel, for instance, where Peter says, I'm going fishing, and he takes some of the apostles with him. And then the risen Jesus appears to him, and they have breakfast, and he says, Peter, do you love me? Tend my sheep. That fishing thing was definitely deep in Peter's heart. As he's pondering over the mysteries that were Holy Week, I imagine, and the fact that the Lord had already risen and appeared to them, he wanted to go fishing. There's something about it that he likes. And yet Simon and Andrew leave their nets and follow Jesus. Think to James and John. They're literally working with their Father in that very moment. Could you imagine having the thought run through your head, if I leave my dad, I'm leaving him with more work, for sure, but is he going to be okay? If I go follow this Jesus guy, who I really have no guarantees about, is this all going to work out? And yet they do. And I think it's because, going back to this principle of agere contra, they had freedom in their hearts. They weren't bound by these fears to say, if I leave my nets, I'm leaving my livelihood. If I leave my father, he might not be okay. They were in a place of interior freedom, detachment from the fears that could rise in their hearts, and they were able to follow Jesus. Okay, think to your own particular life. One of the big questions that's on, I think, most people's minds and hearts is vocation, or any kind of discernment, really. I know one of the resistances I run into the most about priesthood is people are freaked out by the idea of celibacy. That you have to live alone, that you can't get married. Isn't that lonely? Isn't that terrible? And if you have that fear in you, you can't very well discern that priesthood is for you. Think even in married life or dating relationships. If you can't even ask the girl out, you'll never be in a relationship. Because fear can rise up and say, geez, I'm afraid of being rejected. I'm afraid that this might not all go well. And so if there's fear, you can't even take the first step to decide whether this is a good thing or not. Any decision that's made in life My hope is that more and more the fears get removed from those realities. I'm afraid of what my livelihood will look like. I'm afraid of, will I have friends? Will I fit in? Will I whatever? The doubts that plague the mind. I want ultimately for every one of you freedom. Because if you have freedom, if Jesus really is calling you to something in particular, even though you might be pulled this way or that way because in this moment you're weeping or rejoicing or whatever else is going on, you will be grounded and centered. You'll be able to hear the voice of God instead of hearing your anxieties or hearing about the present moment and all you're worried about. I hope you have the freedom that if Jesus calls you to go someplace you're not terribly comfortable with, that you'll go. So before all of that, remove the freedoms from your heart and your mind, bring those to prayer, and then begin to discern, what is God calling you to do?